Hello there, this is Coden.
And this is Cassia.
And welcome back to the Ebon Hawk, a podcast where we discuss the Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic series and proposed movie adaptations, as well as Star Wars news. This is episode 2. This is where the sand begins. All right, let's get into our first topic today. This is regarding David Benioff and D.B. Weiss's involvement with Disney and Star Wars. Initially, they had set up an agreement back in 2018 to do a Star Wars Trilogy going over the origins of the Jedi. But there's been recent talk of how they have now left Disney in pursuit of their agreement with Netflix.
Yeah. It looks like that deal they originally struck at Disney, it was announced like in February 2018. They were going to have not just one film, but 3 films, and the first was going to be released in 2022, the second would follow up in 2024, and the conclusion would be in 2026. It's interesting to see they're walking away from a whole trilogy.
I was looking at different discussions here and there of why that could have been, because, there's the public news that they've dropped Star Wars in favor of Netflix, but there's other political items that may have come up, and corporate political items that have come up that have also may have influenced this decision. LucasArts has a history, especially recently, where they're very strict on the creative control that the directors have on creating a Star Wars story. And from David Benioff and D.B. Weiss's discussions, they had a lot of ideas that they wanted to present, but it's very possible that Disney put the foot down and didn't want to tell that kind of story, which may have also influenced the separation of the pair from the Lucasfilms deal.
Yeah, Lucasfilm has had a hard time with writers and directors. They fired Josh Trank from a standalone Star Wars film in 2015. Gareth Edwards, the director, Gareth Edwards had to kind of let someone else do reshoots of his film. I believe that was Gilroy who did the reshoots for that. Gareth Edwards ended up getting the credit for Rogue One, but there were substantial reshoots, I think, to align it with what Lucasfilm wanted. Colin Trevorrow was going to direct episode 9, but he was let go before that could happen, just around the time, I think, The Last Jedi came out. And then Phil Lord and Chris Miller were fired, in the middle of Solo being filmed.
Yeah, and what I'm also understanding, too, is that there's an extensive amount of reshoots that have been done for Star Wars Episode 9, and so it's apparent that Disney wasn't happy with some ideas that have initially been plotted out for Star Wars 9, and we're going to be seeing something very different in theaters next month.
Yeah, I mean, there are reshoots for every type of film, but especially with these big blockbuster films, when it's made by a group of people who all want to see certain things happen, a story group, or made by a board, you see that happen a lot. Trailers will show a lot of images or scenes, and then they're missing from the movies, and then there's substantial reshoots, because a lot of these big productions are trying to, make money like everyone else is, and they just try to find what works and film that and market it well. I remember when Rogue One, the trailer came out, and then seeing it come out in theaters, there were a lot of missing scenes, and it was kind of the same with Suicide Squad and a lot of the recent Marvel films. Their trailers were a bit different as well, so it is kind of a common thing, but hopefully the end product is good. But yeah, Benioff and Weiss leaving, when it was first announced, I was like, okay, maybe I wouldn't have chosen them, but maybe they could be a good fit, because I don't know if season 7 had quite come out yet. And I was like, oh, seasons 1 through 6 are pretty decent. I think like seasons 1 through 3 of Game of Thrones were obviously strongest, the best. But I was like, if they have something to adapt from, I think they do pretty well, and everything has been solid so far. I don't know if they're quite the right fit for Star Wars, but I'll keep an open mind, and I'm sure it'll be great. But then when I kind of saw season 7 and 8 of Game of Thrones, I just was getting more and more nervous, because I thought that season 7 and 8 really plummeted in quality of the story and writing. And it just felt rushed, and it just really divided the fan base. And I just was kind of worried about, like, in the rush for certain writers and directors to quote unquote subvert expectations, that maybe Benioff and Weiss, maybe that would not be the right creative team at this time. Or maybe I didn't want them there touching Star Wars ever.
Yeah, we see a lot of movies pull in Marvel stars or Game of Thrones stars. Sometimes in some Marvel movies, they pull Game of Thrones stars into Marvel in hopes that it pulls audiences, it pulls funding. And to me, the initial idea of Lucasfilms pulling David Benioff and D.B. Weiss as directors is because they have that Game of Thrones influence, which is debatable on how effective that really is. And now we're seeing that because they want to take a different approach than what Disney wants to market, there's a separation.
Yeah. But how do you feel after finding out that they were exiting?
Well, I mean, it could be a number of things. As far as they themselves, I'm not too concerned. As you mentioned before, the season 7 and season 8 of Game of Thrones were a little bit rushed. I'd say season 8 was more so than season 7. Season 7 was more of the build up to the climax, and 8 was supposed to be kind of the ultimate conclusion. So I give season 7 a little bit more credit, but I just feel that there are better people available to handle a sci-fi story, where these guys are pretty competent in telling a very good fantasy story.
Yeah, I guess I just have to say, I'm a little bit relieved seeing that Benioff and Weiss walked away or fired. I'm not quite sure. But now I'm just kind of wondering if Game of Thrones went downhill for no reason, because it seemed like season 7 and 8 were rushed so Benioff and Weiss could go handle Star Wars, and now they don't have Star Wars. It's just kind of funny. So Game of Thrones fans might be feeling a little smug right now. But this all kind of happened after the Austin Film Festival. And I just kind of have to wonder if the decision for Disney to fire them or whatever happened because of this film festival. Benioff and Weiss didn't go to San Diego Comic-Con. They dropped out last minute. They didn't really want to see the fans there. But at the Austin Film Festival, they were talking to an audience, and they kind of just admitted they made a whole lot of mistakes, basic writing mistakes, handling the show. They were just learning on the job, and they just described managing Game of Thrones as an expensive film school. A lot of the first season, the episodes' runtimes were averaging 39 minutes, and HBO was you got to make these an hour. So then they had to write and shoot 100 extra minutes on top of the season 1 that was already recorded. And then when they were doing that, they're oh, Robert and Cersei, who are married, and their relationship crumbling is kind of a huge story point. Robert and Cersei hadn't shared a scene this whole season until they had to be told to film more scenes. And they kind of just said they didn't quite understand the characters, which you have a whole lot of books where you can read to understand the characters, you know? The books are substantial and long and pretty well written. So I just don't understand how they say, like, they didn't understand the characters. And they told HBO that they would dial down on the fantasy elements just so everyone could get into it, which the fantasy is a big part of A Saga of Ice and Fire, as the book series is called. Fantasy is a huge part of that world. They didn't really listen to fan feedback, and they kind of couldn't dial down the books to the major elements because they were just so big, and they were just kind of focused on subverting expectations. But it kind of blew up on Twitter, that thread from the Austin Film Festival, and I think that it only just fueled the fire for any decisions that Disney had made to walk away from Benioff and Weiss, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I think both parties could be to blame here, and it wouldn't surprise me if they walked away or if Disney fired them. Like, either way would have made perfect sense. And I don't consider Disney a perfect studio, and I don't consider the pair of directors, amazing directors either.
Do you think they were fired or they walked away?
I believe they walked away. I believe that Disney wanted the names to be part of the Disney Star Wars upcoming trilogy, but they didn't want the mind that came with the names, and the conflict that the two were receiving. Netflix was going to let them have creative freedom with their project they're working on, and Disney wasn't. And with the potential of how the last couple Star Wars movies performed, it just seems to me that the pair of directors were more concerned about their future as opposed to what Disney was requesting.
I kind of think they walked away because I think they wanted the money that Netflix was offering, and I don't think they wanted to work like another decade working for Star Wars, not their own universe or their own ideas. And I think they kind of just, it's money, If the Game of Thrones fan base is mad, it would be hard to walk into the arena right now, I think, where Star Wars fans are very divided, to put it delicately.
I don't know about divided. I just think there's a miscommunication between the studio and the fans. I think the studio thinks that there's a particular fan base out there, but if there is, it's very slim compared to the fan base that is actually out there.
Yeah. So there's some disconnect. And I don't think it will always be that way, but I think it just needs to be bridged. But I can understand that Benioff and Weiss just might not want to venture into that arena right now. So I think they just wanted to have creative control and money, and which is kind of sad. Like, if I were given the choice, I am co-hosting a Star Wars podcast, but I would like to think if I was like given the opportunity for like a big paycheck or Star Wars, like, I think I would choose Star Wars. So I guess we'll just have to see what happens in the future, because always in motion the future is. And I don't know what the next Star Wars film is going to be after episode 9, because we have the streaming service, we have The Mandalorian coming out this month, and then Obi-Wan, the Obi-Wan series, and Cassian Andor. But I don't believe there's a movie on the schedule, so because the only ones that were on the schedule officially was this proposed trilogy, and now it's gone. So I guess we'll just have to wait in anticipation.
It may not be gone, too. They may have pulled the product away from David Benioff and D.B. Weiss, and it's likely that they'll just take, the scraps of what they've had, and they'll just move it to somebody else to see if they'll deliver what they want them to deliver.
Yeah.
But, yeah, as far as the timetable goes, it appears that Disney is going to gauge the success of the Disney Plus, make a plan according to what would work. It's possible that instead of doing a theatrical release, they'll do a straight to Disney Plus release
Hmm.
with Star Wars products. As if it's part of a consumer subscription, it may be more enticing to view instead of having to pay individually for the theatrical viewing. And with how analytics kind of skew with subscription and viewing, they may just pursue that route.
Yeah, I think the Dawn of the Jedi story would be a fascinating one to see on the big screen. I think I would prefer to see it on the big screen. It's a good story, but I think I'm relieved that they're not going to be the ones to tell it, but I would want it to be told. I would want like Lucas's ideas to be involved, but I guess perhaps we'll see that story in the future, just maybe not right now. And that concludes the saga of Ice and Fired.
Yeah, and speaking of Star Wars news, our second topic I wanted to review was Jedi Fallen Order. We want to review this briefly. This is a game in development and upcoming release, which I've mentioned in the last two broadcasts. A little bit about this game, since we've mentioned it a couple times. It's an upcoming single-player action-adventure video game developed by Respawn Entertainment, who is new to building a Star Wars game. It's set in the Star Wars universe shortly after Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. You play as one of the last surviving Jedi, Jedi Padawan Cal Kestis, who somehow has so far escaped Order 66 and is on the run from the Galactic Empire. You follow him as he attempts to survive while being chased by the Empire, and throughout the journey there will be new worlds, an iconic one from Star Wars lore such as Kashyyyk, among others. The gameplay looks more like The Force Unleashed, as the combat is more real-time, wielding your lightsaber as well as force powers that you learn throughout the game. This is opposed to the Knights of the Republic, where it's more of a pause action game type, where you pause the game, you kind of set up some actions, and then you play those actions out, and then you re-pause the game and set up a new order. Some of my thoughts I have on this title is I've only recently started eyeing this game down, as Electronic Arts haven't had the best reputation. We're not going to get into that here. Just some past titles, both Star Wars among others, have been a bit controversial just in the gaming space. As it's still Star Wars, it seemed necessary to look into and just share as part of the podcast. My first concern with this title is, how does this Jedi Padawan escape under the Imperial radar at a time where the deployed Jedi Order were escorted and under the care of the Republic Clone Army, and those who stayed behind were killed at the Jedi Temple by the 501st, led by Darth Vader. So my thinking is how does a Jedi Padawan escape this catastrophe, unlike some of the more experienced Jedi who be able to handle these clone troopers? My second concern, of course, is the cast delivery, or how well the different characters fit in their role and how it fits in the larger picture. The Electronic Arts' previous title, The Campaign in Star Wars Battlefront 2, it came across as more political and frankly unremarkable, since a compelling plot and gameplay were secondary to a more obvious point they were trying to make. But so far, the gameplay demos that have been released seem to be pretty solid. Other than the Force Unleashed vibe you get off the combat, there's also kind of an element of Dark Souls, though, to be clear, not as difficult. And that's just to my understanding. Since you wield a lightsaber, it's mentioned that if you play your cards right, you can strike down an enemy with just a single hit, which is unique to previous Star Wars titles in the past, which tend to follow just the traditional health bar and whatnot. So these are some items that I hope we can identify and discuss down the road, whether that's going to be on just the Twitch feed that'll be going on, or through Twitter, or through the podcast, and we'll just play it as it lands. So just to segue over to this, I'll be streaming that on twitch.tv/Coden, as well as just posting bits and pieces about what we'll be talking about, as well as this video game on Twitter at Coden.
And then if you want to email us your comments and questions, you can reach us at ebonhawkpodcast@gmail.com, and you can follow us on Instagram at ebonhawkpodcast. And our intro and outro themes were composed by Alistair Scheuermann. He can be found at alistairsounds.wixsite.com/Alistair Sounds.
So this has been Coden.
This has been Cassia.
And this has been the episode 2 of The Ebon Hawk. Take care of yourselves, Meatbag, and may the Force be with you. We'll be back next week. Bye for now.